Good afternoon. Excuse me. Good afternoon. I'm Heinrich von Staden, a member of the faculty in the Institute's School of Historical Studies. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session this afternoon. It's a session which, of course, continues our day-long commemoration not only of the founding of the Institute for Advanced Study 75 years ago, but also of Einstein. And this afternoon's program, as you will have noted, turns from his annus mirabilis to further very interesting and important, I think, aspects of his life, of his thought, and of his activities. Before we turn to the 5 talks on the program, it is a pleasure to invite a few words from what turns out to be a former colleague of mine at Yale University, but here this afternoon, joining us in his capacity as a representative of a neighboring institution which has been and continues to be of fundamental importance to the intellectual and scholarly vitality of the Institute community. I'm of course referring to Princeton University, represented today, to our joy, by Professor David Dobkin, Dean of the Faculty and a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the university. Professor Dobkin.
Thank you, Professor von Staden. It's a privilege and honor for me to represent Princeton on this happy occasion as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of your founding and of our wonderful relationship together. It's staggering, actually frightening, for me to think of the former members of this institute and just what they've contributed to the world via their collective wisdom. I know that I speak for all of my colleagues at Princeton when I say that we've been incredibly fortunate to have you as neighbors, to share close intellectual ties with the Institute, and to have close physical proximity. Beyond the intellectual interactions, which are well documented, we appreciate the ability to walk from our campus, enjoy your woods, to come to talks here, to eat lunch in your cafeteria. And we know that your faculty share the same privileges on our campus, and we appreciate the back and forth that's enabled by this. Now, turning to Einstein, and in particular to the annus mirabilis, I think of the year 1905 and think ahead to the year 2105 and wonder about the remarkable things that are happening now and just being documented that we'll look back to 100 years from now and think of the great synergies that happened at the university, at the institute, in the broader world, happening now that can be celebrated 100 years from now. Over the last 75 years, the best minds on our faculties have shared ideas in many fields of knowledge. And in fact, if we turn back to Einstein, I will remind you of something that most of you know. Einstein's first office was actually on our campus in the old Fine Hall. And just as Ed Regis in 1988 wrote a book that caused us all to wonder which office he had at the Institute, we now are wondering which desk he had at Princeton. One of the added benefits for us of having the Institute close by is that many of our faculty have taken sabbaticals at the Institute. This has given them the opportunity to focus on a new book, a new theory, or a new invention. I remember running into one of my colleagues, an English professor who always seems very harried, as he was coming back from his sabbatical at the Institute, and I asked him how it had been, and the 2 words he used were idyllic and heavenly. By offering him this respite from the demands of teaching, student advising, and the many committees he was serving on, the Institute provided a sanctuary for thoughtful reflection and creation. And you also provided the ability for this great scholar to add to knowledge. And basically, ours is a working collaboration that really works. So on behalf of President Tillman, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and the entire academic community at Princeton, I salute you for the remarkable achievements of your past 75 years and extend warm congratulations on this occasion. And I look forward to many future years of this great collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Dobkin. For many years, our next speaker, who will give the first in a series of 5 talks in the program this afternoon, was perhaps best known as a distinguished mathematical physicist, one of the pioneers of string theory, and as master of St. John's College in the University of Cambridge in England. Peter Goddard, of course, to our enormous joy, joined us in January of 2004 as the director of the Institute. I, as an historian, have been struck how much Peter Goddard, since joining the Institute, has gained knowledge, a deep knowledge of the Institute's history, and not only that, how deeply he grasps the importance of this historical knowledge for leading the Institute into the future. Today, he takes us back to the beginnings of this institutional history with a talk on the founding of the Institute for Advanced Study. Peter.
Well, thank you, Heinrich, for those very kind words, but I should begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a historian. I'm not a particular expert on the Institute's history, but my colleagues in the director's office decided that somebody had to speak on this subject, and they knew that a major qualification for the office of director was a willingness to speak on subjects on which one is not expert. Well, where did the Institute begin? How did it begin? Arguably, it began here. This is Bamberger's store in Newark. The founder of the store, in its heyday one of the leading department stores in the country, was Louis Bamberger. He had been born in Baltimore in 1855, and he left school at 14 to work in his uncle's store. He was ambitious. He studied the retail business and accumulated capital so he could set up in business himself. In 1892, he purchased the stock of a bankrupt firm in Newark and opened a retail store in the premises that firm had vacated. He had partners, his sister's husband, Louis Frank, and an acquaintance, Felix Ford. His sister Carrie also joined the business, and the 4 of them set up house together near Newark. The business prospered, and after Louis Frank died in 1910, Carrie married Felix Ford. Here they are together, and she became Caroline Bamberger Frank Ford, embodying the whole partnership in her name. It is for Caroline, or Carrie, and as she was known, and Felix Ford, that Ford Hall was named. And you may have noticed their bust to either side of you in the porch as you come in. The Bamberger store was run on innovative lines. They introduced money-back guarantees and price tags on merchandise, so you didn't have to ask the cost. They provided good conditions for their employees, encouraging education and career progression. They had a branch at the public library on the store premises, and they provided classes in merchandising. They also contributed to charities, particularly ones serving the Jewish community: hospitals, youth clubs, museums, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and so on. Here's Bamberger outside the new building that he funded in 1926 for the Newark Museum with a gift of $700,000. Things changed dramatically for the Bambergers in 1929. They did for many wealthy people with the stock market crash in October, but it was different for the Bambergers. In January 1929, Felix Ford died suddenly, and Louis Bamberger, now aged 73, did not feel that he and Carrie could carry on the business alone. Ford and Bamberger had complemented one another. Ford was more enterprising, and Bamberger, a shy and reserved man, more cautious. So Carrie and Lewis decided to sell the store to their rivals, Macy's, for about $25 million, more than $11 million in cash, and the remainder in Macy's shares. The shares continued to rise to a high of $255 in September 1929 and fell to $110 in November 1929, reaching a low of $17 in 1932 before they started going up again. Exactly when the Bambergers if they did, got out of those shares, I don't know. Macy's kept the Bamberger name into the 1980s. Here is a bill for the Niels Bohr when visiting the Institute in 1948 with a charge for sheets and towels from Bambergers. I should interject this moment that in what I'm showing you here, I profited enormously from the help of George Dyson and Linda Arntzenius in providing materials. Bamberger ensured that his senior staff will benefit from the sale of the enterprise, completed just in the nick of time before the crash. He distributed over $1 million of the proceeds to them, the senior staff. The Bambergers had plans for the rest of their fortune. They felt they had benefited greatly from the state of New Jersey and its people, and from the people of Newark in particular. They also wanted to do something to counter the prejudice against Jews that they perceived as prevalent in the medical profession and in medical education, at least in the great cities. They therefore proposed to establish a medical school in Newark with preference for Jewish students. To take this project forward, they enlisted two of their advisors, Samuel Leidsdorf, an accountant, and Herbert Maas, a lawyer. Perhaps interject here that it was good to be reminded of the vital connections we still have with these founding moments. When Carl Kaysen became director, Samuel Leidsdorf was the chair of the Board of Trustees, and it's a particular pleasure that we have Carl with us this afternoon. So Leidsdorf and Maas made inquiries about who could provide advice on establishing a medical school, and every time they asked that question, they were directed to Mr. Abraham Flexner. Abraham Flexner was born in 1866 in Louisville, Kentucky, and this is where one of the other strands of the Institute's history starts. He was the sixth son of German Jewish immigrants, Moritz and Flexner and Esther Abraham. Abraham was one of 9 children. The whole family of 11 is seen in this photograph. It was a remarkable family. 5 of the 6 boys ended up listed in Who's Who, for want of a better criterion of having made it, all getting their starts comparatively late in life. The father, Moritz, started at Louisville as a tinker, becoming a wholesale hat merchant before being ruined in the panic of 1873. This had a disastrous impact on the family circumstances. There was no hope of a college education for Abraham's 5 older brothers. They left school and went to work to support the family. Abraham was precocious. Here he is at 17. He read voraciously in the public library, where he worked after school. Father, having died, his eldest brother Jacob pinned the family hopes on Abraham and sacrificed to send him to Baltimore, to the Johns Hopkins University, just founded 8 years earlier. The 2 years that Abraham spent at Johns Hopkins were a turning point for him and for his whole family. Johns Hopkins laid a stress on postgraduate education, then quite rare in the United States. When Abraham graduated after 2 years, in 1886, he wanted to stay on for further study, but the fellowship he needed eluded him. So he returned to Louisville to teach Latin and Greek at Louisville High School, from which he'd graduated those 2 years earlier. He was a very successful teacher, and he developed an interest in education. His reputation grew, and he was approached by a father with an offer of a substantial fee if he could prepare his son, who had been expelled from a school back east, for entry into Princeton University. He decided that this could be interesting and rewarding, and he decided to set up his own school at its height. to prepare boys and some girls for entry into the Ivy League colleges. All of his first 100 students got into the colleges for which they were aiming. Those of you who've been involved on the teaching side of this process know that that sort of success rate depends at least as much on adjusting parental expectations as it does in improving the performance of the students. His success was such that it was noted by President Eliot of Harvard University. Among his pupils was one Anne Crawford, who gained entry to Vassar College. When she returned to Louisville on graduating, she did some teaching back at Mr. Flexner's school. Romance blossomed and they married in 1898. Anne Crawford Flexner was not intending to remain a schoolteacher. Her ambition was to be a playwright. And after a couple of plays which met with little success, in 1903 she wrote Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch, based on a best-selling novel of the same name by her friend Alice Riggs. Perhaps not so well known today, but it was a great success at the time. It was the biggest hit on Broadway for 7 years from 1904. W.C. Fields starred in one of the 4 film versions, and Mae West was in one of the touring companies. And Anne Flexner, importantly, got 50% of the profits. This picture, this is her in 1920, and unfortunately the play depicted here, All Souls' Eve, was pretty much a flop, but the money was still coming in from Mrs. Wiggs. It was the financial success of Anne's plays rather than the great success of the Flexner School that enabled Abraham Flexner to leave Louisville and begin to make his way on the national and international scene. And so in 1905, he sold his school for a good price and went to spend a year studying psychology and philosophy at Harvard, gaining an MA degree. After Harvard, he went with his wife to study in Germany, and there he wrote a caustic commentary on the deficiencies of American higher education, published as the American College. This caught the attention of the president of the newly formed Carnegie Foundation, and he commissioned Flexner to produce a report on medical education in the United States and Canada. Flexner visited each of the 155 medical schools in North America personally. His tough report, exposing powerful and profitable vested interest, tenaciously resistant to criticism, resulted in the closure of 2/3 of those medical schools and established his reputation. The Flexner Report of 1910 remains a landmark in the history of medical education. Flexner was next commissioned to produce a report on medical education in Europe for the Carnegie Foundation. At this time, he also began working for the Rockefeller Foundation and was commissioned to write a report on the challenging topic of the regulation and suppression of prostitution in Europe. He approached this task with his characteristic thoroughness. As someone put it, he was as adept at extracting information from a streetwalker as inspiring the generosity of a millionaire. Innocently, I suppose, he describes in a letter home to his wife taking an attractive young Parisian woman to dinner and then accompanying her back to her Montmartre apartment to talk about her life. When he gave her several pieces of gold for her time, she asked, "Was that all that he wanted?" When he replied yes, she replied, "You're not a man, you're an angel." "No," said Flexner, "I'm a man, all right." This woman became his unofficial guide to places in Paris that the authorities did not want him to see. When he came to leave Paris, he asked if he could do anything else for her. She said he could take her out to dine like a lady and then on to the opera. This isn't actually Flexner, of course. But somehow, when Hollywood comes to make the biopic of Abe Flexner's life, Richard Gere is the obvious candidate to play. So Flexner took her to the Café de Paris for dinner and on to the opera to see The Sorrows of Young Werther. Flexner worked for the General Board of Education of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1913 to 1928, when he was ousted from this very influential post as head of the Division of Studies of the General Education Board after losing an internal power struggle. He was then age 62. At this point, he was invited to Oxford University to deliver the Rhodes Lectures, and he developed these into a book, Universities English, American English and German. Then Messrs. Leidsdorf and Maas arrived in his office, and here, this isn't the younger Flexner taking them by the arm. This is actually Eddie Cantor in some other episode in their life. When they arrived in his office, he had the proofs of the first section of his book on his desk. So Leidsdorf and Maas asked him about the Bamberger's proposal to establish a medical school in Newark, and he was disparaging of the idea. A first-rate medical school needed an outstanding teaching hospital. It needed to be associated with a leading university. And Newark was too close to New York to set up in competition with the medical schools there. And also, he didn't think that the way to counter anti-Semitism would be to set up institutions favoring Jews. But never one to leave a vacuum, he asked his visitors if they had ever dreamed a dream, and then proceeded to tell them of his dream: the establishment in America of a purely graduate university devoted to learning and researching rather than undergraduate teaching. His book praised the German universities with their greater opportunities for postgraduate research, and was scathing about the American colleges with their focus on undergraduate general education, with graduate study then merely grafted on. Whilst at the Rockefeller Foundation, he'd sought to encourage Johns Hopkins, his alma mater, and the University of Chicago to downplay or remove undergraduate teaching. Flexner was not the only person dreaming dreams. Earlier, in 1924, Oswald Veblen had written to Abraham's older brother, Simon, then director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which became Rockefeller University. He was seeking support for establishing a mathematics research institute whose needs would be simple: a library, a few offices, lecture rooms, some computing machines, mechanical ones of course, and the main expense would be salaries. Simon told Veblen to contact his brother Abe. Veblen was not the first. His uncle, the economist Thorsten Veblen, right in 1916, this is a later edition of the book, argues for the establishment of an international research institute where academics could pursue their chosen work. But Abraham had already been thinking along these ideas even before Oswald Veblen contacted him in 1924. Soon after Leidsdorf and Maas appeared in his office, Flexner was invited to meet the Bambergers in their suite at the Hotel Madison in New York, and the Bambergers were convinced to abandon the idea of a medical school, but not yet Newark, and to make $5 million available for what was to be named the Institute for Advanced Study. By 1930, in May, the Bambergers had designated Flexner as the first director, and on the 20th of that month, 75 years ago today, the Institute was formally established. On June the 4th, they wrote to the first trustees of the Embryonic Institute to charge them with their task. They wrote, "There is never likely to be an overabundance of opportunities for men and women engaged in the pursuit of advanced learning in the various fields of human knowledge. Particularly so far as we are aware, there is no institution in the United States where scientists and scholars devote themselves at the same time to serious research and to the training of competent postgraduate students, entirely and independently separated from both the charms and the diversions inseparable from an institution, the major interest of which is the teaching of undergraduates." Rather charming phrase. "It's our desire, therefore, that the proposed institution shall contain no undergraduate department, and it shall bestow only the PhD degree, or professional degrees of equal value, and that its standards of admission and methods of work shall be on such a basis and upon that alone." Although it has been and continues to be empowered to award the PhD degree with admirable self-restraint, in 75 years the Institute has never. Echoing Flexner's philosophy, the founders specified that there is to be no discrimination on the grounds of race, creed, or sex. And they stipulate that the Institute for Advanced Study, as it was already called, should be situated in the state of New Jersey, that the endowment should not be depleted in order to construct buildings, and importantly, that no gifts should ever be accepted from outside sources which would change the fundamental aims of the Institute, a precept to which the Institute has rigorously adhered. Founders retained their desire that the Institute should be in Newark. The draft bylaws originally stated that it should be located in the county of Essex, where Newark is. They had in mind that the Institute should be built on their 38-acre estate in South Orange. Flexner was dismayed at this. The Institute needed to be near a great library and the wider intellectual community of a great university. Given the constraint of New Jersey, in 1930, this pointed to Princeton. Only slowly, and with the support garnered from the trustees and leading scholars, did he manage to convince the Bambergers that Princeton would be the location for the Institute. The establishing of the new Institute was announced to the world on June the 7th, 1930. On October the 10th, the trustees met for the first time for an organizational meeting at the Uptown Club on East 2nd Street in New York City. Flexner set out his plans for the Institute to the meeting. A free society of scholars and students devoted to the higher training of men and to the advancement of knowledge. It was first and foremost to be a quiet retreat, a fortress of learning. At its heart were the faculty, who needed only simple surroundings, protection from interference, generous professional remuneration, little supervision, and freedom from any obligation to entice or compel students to work. I shall seek a few first-rate men, he said, and give them ample salaries on condition they hold up their end of the job. Such a paradise for scholars will provide the new stimulus, the new ideal, so badly needed in higher education, he argued. As for the small number of students he anticipated, there would be none of the disastrous luxury lavished on them by contemporary universities, a pampering that turned them into Sybarites instead of the Spartans they ought to be. The proceedings of the organizational meeting were published in December 1930. And then Flexner went on his travels, consulting in person and by correspondence with the leading American and European scholars. In October 1931, he presented a carefully drafted confidential memorandum to the trustees setting out his plans in more detail. The Institute will be neither a current university struggling with diverse tasks and many students, nor a research institute devoted solely to the solution of problems. It can be pictured as a wedge between the two. And he wrote, I should think of a circle called the Institute for Advanced Study. Within this, I should, one by one, as men and funds are available, and only then, create a series of schools or groups, a school of mathematics, a school of economics, a school of history, a school of philosophy, etc. The schools may change from time to time. In any event, the designations are to be so broad that they may readily cover one group of activities today and quite another as time goes on. Each school should conduct its affairs in its own way, for neither the subjects nor the scholars will all fit in one mode. In his memorandum, Flexner also suggested the subjects with which the Institute should start, proposing mathematics as the dearest of disciplines, antecedent to the sciences, and, as he put it, to philosophy and economics, and so to all the other social disciplines. When funds permitted, he would add economics. That was his plan. Some of Flexner's advisors thought he was too obsessed with European models for the Institute. His brothers Simon and Bernard, a leading New York attorney, urged him to visit the West Coast, and Caltech in particular, and that way he headed in February 1932. Also visiting Caltech at the time was Albert Einstein, already an iconic figure. Encouraged by others to talk to Einstein, Flexner found him full of enthusiasm for his plan, and they agreed to discuss them further in Oxford that summer. 8 months after his visit to Caltech, Abraham Flexner was able to announce publicly the creation of the School of Mathematics, with the appointment of Einstein and Veblen to the first faculty positions, each at a salary of $15,000 a year, equal to that, it said at the time, of the president of Princeton University, a linkage I don't think has been maintained. By the time the first session of the Institute began, in September 1933, a faculty of 5 leading mathematicians and theoretical physicists had been assembled for the school: Alexander, Einstein, Veblen, von Neumann, Weil. It had not all been plain sailing. Weil had differed about accepting until Hitler's taking power in Germany in March 1933 convinced him to leave Göttingen for the Institute. Weil's vacillation aroused the disapproval of the Bambergers. Flexner told their advisor and fellow trustee, Herbert Maas, that the Bambergers would have to get used to people different from the ordinary if he was to build a great institute. And he also warned them that Einstein had done some foolish things in Europe in the summer of 1933, and that he would contrive to manage the Einsteins when they got to Princeton. And I expect that George Dyson will be telling us more about these things. As we heard, the School of Mathematics was accommodated on the university campus initially. It was there in the old fine hall, now Jones Hall, that it opened for business, so to speak, in December 1933. Flexner wrote to Felix Frankfurter, a trustee and then a professor at the Harvard Law School, to tell him how life at the new institute was shaping up. "I wish very much that you might have been on this side during these first months of the institute," he wrote. "What has happened is not exactly what I planned, but it's much better than I planned. I frequently used the phrase paradise for scholars without any very distinct notion of just how a paradise would be created. What has happened is the following. We have 5 mathematicians of great eminence, each with his own work to do. We have admitted to the Institute about 20 persons who have shown capacity for independent work, persons who have already attained the rank of assistant professor, associate professor in an American university or abroad. They have been turned loose in Fine Hall without any regulations whatsoever. The professors, of course, know, what they want to do and are doing it. The students shop around in order to find the man who can be most helpful to them." Tea was immediately a central feature of institute life. Every afternoon, tea is served informally, and there is, to my astonishment, an attendance of about 60, comprising both the advanced workers and the staff of Princeton and our own folk. They talk mathematics, but not only mathematics, and drift in and out without explanation or ascertainable reason. Inasmuch as our workers have all been teachers, working under a heavy routine for some years, they are as happy as birds, doing precisely the things that they have wanted to do. Fundamentally, since those first months of the Institute, not much has changed. But Felix Frankfurter, seen here, was rather curmudgeonly, and he played the role of the devil's advocate amongst the trustees most of the time. He didn't like Flexner's exuberance. Across the letter from Flexner, his copy of it, he scrawled, "News from paradise, not my style." And to Flexner, he commented, "Nor do I think it very helpful to take too seriously the exuberant rhetoric of thinking of the Institute as a paradise of scholars. For one thing, the natural history of paradise is none too encouraging as a precedent. Apparently, it was an excellent place for one person, but it was fatal even for 2, at least for 2 when the snake entered. And the snake seems to have been an early and congenial companion of man. Really, figures of speech are among the most fertile sources of intellectual confusion. Let's try to aim at something human, for we are dealing with humans and not with angels." That's something I'm sure that all of my 7 predecessors of director have learnt. The Institute has stayed remarkably true to the vision provided to the founders, Louis Bamberger and Carrie Ford, by Abraham Flexner. The time was ripe for that idea, but it needed to be articulated, resourced, and realized. That the Institute has remained true to its original mission is a tribute both to the importance and continued relevance of that mission and to the magnificence of the Bambergers' generosity. To provide a haven where distinguished scholars and scientists can pursue disinterested, curiosity-driven research into fundamental questions meets a need at least as pressing now as it was even in 1930. The ability of the Institute to pursue entirely on the continuing strength of its resources, its endowment. And in this anniversary year, we will be reaffirming both the importance and relevance of that mission and our commitment to maintaining and enhancing the strength of the endowment initially provided by the Bambergers that makes the work of this institute possible.
tremendously interesting remarks, dealing, among other things, with many details which I, in fact, had not been aware of before. Our next speaker is George Dyson, who previously has been a visitor here at the Institute and who is an historian of technology whose interests range very widely, for example, from the development of kayaks, especially the Aleut kayaks, which he described in a book by Darka, to the evolution of digital computing and telecommunications, dealt with in his book called Darwin Among the Machines, and finally, not finally, but most recently, to nuclear bomb-propelled space exploration in his book Project Orion. I can't refrain from adding that George Dyson is not only a wonderful historian of technology, but also a practitioner of technology. In his workshop, where he lives in the Pacific Northwest, he builds kayaks. Currently, he is compiling an account of the confluence of people, technology, and ideas surrounding von Neumann's electronic computer project at the Institute for Advanced Study from 1945, I believe, to 58? 58, I'm sorry, to 58. And today his topic is Einstein and the Institute. George Dyson.
Thank you. It's absolutely wonderful to be here on this sort of very historic occasion. And thanks to Princeton University, which really did give the Institute its first home. I'll just add one thing, that when the university built Firestone Library, they came hand in hand to the Institute to get some money. And the Institute put in a large amount of money, and in exchange got permanent rights to use that library. And if you read the fine print of that agreement, there was one condition, that if the Institute became larger than the university, the agreement would be revisited. So that's how things looked in 19, back then. There's Einstein in the sculpture of him in 1914. We tend to see mainly pictures of him at the end of his life, and we have to remember how young he was when he came here, and how the Institute and Einstein were sort of on collision course. I mean, all the forces that forced Einstein to leave Europe were the forces that led the founders we just heard about so wonderfully from Peter, that really drove them. Why did they need to build this institute? Well, because people were being so threatened in Europe, and this was really the refuge, the home, sort of a wildlife preserve for the intellect. And we have to credit Veblen for pushing real hard to acquire all this land. You don't need 800 acres to write papers on physics. But Veblen, all these people were outdoorsmen. They really spent a lot of time outdoors. They loved the woods. They all went up to Maine, and Ontario. Flexner had a place in Ontario. So they loved the natural surroundings and built this really, people have room to think. So it was Einstein's home. I'm just going to tell you a very narrow bit of the whole sort of picture of how he was here. That was me in the middle there, the year that Einstein died, 1955. So I did not know him. I mean, I was 2 years old when he died. But he died actually on my older sister, Katerina, there, the older girl. It was her birthday, April 18th, the day he died. And she remembers him quite well. He loved children. We ended up knowing him, and really I think many of you know Einstein best. I mean, he left his impact not just himself, but through Helen Dukas, his secretary, who joined him in 1928. She grew up in a family of 7 children and spent her whole life devoted to him. And really, Helen allowed Einstein to be Einstein. But she had no children, and we had no grandparents, so she ended up becoming sort of like Mary Poppins. She showed up and decided to be our babysitter, and had an endless. I mean, if anyone who produced any company that produced a new puzzle or a game or something interesting, they always sent a copy to Professor Einstein. She had all those in a drawer at home, and so she was your dream babysitter. That's her with my younger sister, Dorothy. She took care of these. I had 4 younger sisters. She loved being in a lively household full of kids running around. That's Helen when she was younger. And she changed my life by forcing me. One day I was being really obnoxious, and she just said, "You should do something." I said, "There's nothing to do." "Well, read a book." I said, "There's no books." And so, they were all just grown-up books, but she took down this book and said, "Read this." It was Kon-Tiki, and that truly, reading that book changed me. This is a photograph taken by Gabi Borel here of Helen and Margaret Einstein. So they were an inseparable pair, and we really owe Helen a great debt for preserving the Einstein legacy, for sorting out all his papers before all the other historians showed up later. Einstein and Margaret getting their citizenship. Einstein knew how to have fun. He acted like a child, and it made Princeton a great place to be a child. When sort of the national hero of our town really acted like a child, it really made the Institute much more friendly to children, having someone like that sort of in the lead. He always was more interested to talk to children than many grown-ups. I mean, he had his, and that was Helen's job, was to filter out the grown-ups. I mean, if you were a child, you get through Helen's filter. And he loved sailing, so he became a hero of mine. And this is Einstein at the dedication of Fald Hall in 1939 with Flexner in the middle. And Peter gave us a great description of where Flexner came from. His sort of, one of the other founding documents of the Institute was the usefulness of useful knowledge. Not that the knowledge will always be useless, but you cannot predict what will be useful and what will not. You just have to let knowledge unfold, and the useful stuff will come. And this is his description in 1930, really describing before he had met them. He's sort of waiting for the Bambergers to show up, that, if some fellow or foundation will show up, we'll have our dream, a university without students. Now, is that really the right way to do it or not? But somebody had to do it and try out the experiment. And this description of Walter Stewart, as professor of economics, which sums it up better than anyone else. Just give people who can think the leisure in which to do it. So that's the concept that Flexner presented to Einstein, whose response was in German, he's all for it, fire and flame, sign him up. And there was really very little doubt to Einstein that this exactly matched his dream of course, what he would like for himself, and more importantly, what he wanted for all his colleagues who were facing true persecution we can hardly comprehend today. So that, I think, was one of the main reasons he really signed on to come here, because it offered a stepping stone to bring all these, great numbers of people we've forgotten who came to the Institute as a first step to getting out of Europe at that time. His appointment, October 1st, 1933, so it was an easy appointment to make. It made it very clear to the Bambergers and everyone else what the Institute was about, that it was the kind of place that would give Einstein a home. Then Flexner finds out that the Nazis have seized his bank account and offers that, if so, we'll send you your salary right away. And the age of telegrams is great because things are so concise. Hearty thanks, unnecessary. And then Einstein is going to come over, and Flexner, you can sense that, there was a collision between Flexner and Einstein, that Flexner expected, we saw in the letter that Peter showed, saying that he'll manage the Einsteins when they show up, and Einstein did not want to be managed. So even remotely, while Einstein is on the ship, he's saying, don't talk to the newspapers, get off the boat. He sent Herbert Mass, the trustee, when this was clever, to actually go in a motorboat and pick him up, so that and got permission. So when the ocean liner arrived in New York, Einstein had already been spirited off to New Jersey in a speedboat, and then because the mayor and all the politicians were waiting to make a big deal about Einstein coming to New York, and they snuck him off, because that was sort of New Jersey's coup. And so he came to Princeton and stayed really essentially the rest of his life. His life was very comfortable here. He's at 112 Mercer Street. That's the Institute station wagon that carried all the people at the Institute were carried around in that wagon at the time. And the first faculty meeting, which essentially did, I mean, one of Flexner's stipulations was that there would be no faculty meetings. The faculty would not waste their, if we said, once there were faculty meetings, it was a process that could never be stopped. And that lasted for a certain length of time. The first group of faculty were all mathematicians. Missing from there is John von Neumann. And if you look at the ages of the people, they're very evenly spaced. And that was intentional. Flexner made the point that they were trying to stagger the ages of the people so they would not all retire at the same time. And that still tends to be a problem today. People tend to group up, and then you're stuck having to make 3 replacements at once. So there was a lot of very clear, I mean, the institute was founded by educators. I mean, Flexner was a teacher who really looked at the nuts and bolts of how to run an institution. So Einstein sort of revolted pretty quick. So in 1933, he sort of issues a proposal that they let him go. That well, you know, he has the right, privately he can do what he wants, but if the institute government finds that unbearable, well, they should turn him into just a part-time member, and then he can act on his own. So obviously that shook things up, and some adjustments were made. Flexner backed off, and Einstein stayed. But it was sort of a difficult beginning, and then quite a happy long-term continuation. Then in 1939, Einstein really led what was a revolt at that time. So Einstein, Hetty Goldman, and Marston Morris are issuing a sort of manifesto saying that if the director doesn't back off and give the faculty more power, there's going to be a revolution. And that works. Essentially, Flexner was pushed aside, and Frank Adelot came in, who was far more diplomatic and got along much better with Einstein. There was continually the battle that still exists over space, between the mathematicians and the historians, and whenever you have office space, you have competition for it. And Helen Dukas this was her file on this subject. This was actually the battle that Carl was involved in, and her name for it was, Germans always have a one-word name for everything, but this was the war between the frogs and the mice. So Einstein, that's the mathematicians and the social scientists. But Einstein stayed above that. He was, welcomed by all the groups. He obviously was a humanist as well as a mathematician and a physicist. And the institute, we have to remember, it was built on a battlefield. So it's a natural thing that there would be battles, and there still will be battles, and there will probably be more battles that Peter will face. And it was Veblen's idea to grab this land, 40 acres overlooking the golf course, for $80,000. So, and that was disputed at the time. Did they really need that much land? In the end, of course, they got a lot more. They had to build something on the land. So this is the lunch menu, October 21st, 1937, designing Fald Hall. So on the back of that menu is the first sketch of Fald Hall, with a common room in the middle and the wings of office. This is really essentially how it turned out, and that shows you how informal things were at that time. They didn't have a design competition or a large, I mean, the meeting of the committee was really basically one lunch, and then things were more or less decided. And Fald Hall was quickly built. The structure that's still here today, without the outbuildings that were added later. And if you walked in, then you can see who the key people at the time. Einstein, so where's Einstein's office? It was the corner office right there off the tea room. Von Neumann was closest to the tea room, then Veblen next to Einstein on the first floor. And Thompson, archaeologists, were in the wings. Then on the other side, the director still in the same place. Benjamin Merritt, the library of his material there. And then up above, Adelot, it was now no longer director. This was the Oppenheimer there with Professor Lowe. And Gödel is above von Neumann, and Weil is above Einstein, and Siegel is above Veblen. The library, the entire library was then on the second floor. The other side, Panofsky, the art historian, off here, corner, and Hedy Goldman. And then on the top floor, the third floor of the library, and the fourth floor was the dining room at that time. So everyone ate together. There was dinner every evening for everybody because the group was so much smaller. And we have Einstein's diet, which could probably do well with the Einstein diet. It was really straightforward. A menu from that time. There was none of the sort of pretension we have now that the Institute cafeteria is this great gourmet place. It was just real down-to-earth New Jersey food, and worked very well. The families could eat there, and generally ate there every night. People didn't. The housing project was much more primitive, so it was very good to have a place where you didn't have to cook. And there was still rationing. This is right after the war. So the mayor still in the room, has declared no breadstuffs in restaurants. So they're trying to save food for the rationing effort. And tea, you see how the Institute is growing from 1940-41, serving tea to 4,100 people to 9,600 people just the next year. So the tea service was going up. And the number of members was actually not just steady state, it was up and down. So these are sort of total visiting members. And the budget also reasonably steady. So that's the budget for the school of S of School of Mathematics. So it was not the same expansion that occurred much later. It was fairly level. The School of Economics and Politics was actually a large part of it, which then disappeared sort of with Flexner, and humanistic studies was starting out. And so part of what Einstein did was help make the decisions of who to invite in math, and a little bit of money could go a long way in those days. You see, you get Kurt Gödel for $200 a month, and Paul Erdos for $750 a year. People who say, why was he always begging for food? That may be why. But these are all great people, and it shows you what a center of mathematics it was at the time, and also a center of classical history and other things, and a center that we forget how much the Institute was a center of politics, and I think Einstein had a lot of responsibility for that. After the war, when the League of Nations actually moved some of their offices to the third floor of Fuld Hall, so there were all these international people in Fuld Hall from the League of Nations, and Einstein was very involved in that. It created tension, of course, over office space. Adelot, who was the director after Flexner, was a Quaker and tremendously good at mediating just smoothing out all these disputes. He didn't leave. He was the one director who really left everything in good standing. None of the bitterness or feuds or so on. And the war came to the Institute, and everyone worked for the war effort, including Einstein. Here, showing how he did explosives work, consulting for the Navy. But after the war, the situation strongly diverged. And this is a meeting on the question of whether the Institute should actually open a experimental physics laboratory using the land that's now the wood. So it would have been sort of Los Alamos East. And it actually went to Brookhaven. The lab that is now Brookhaven was being considered at that time for the woods. And so Einstein makes the comment that von Neumann is all for, sort of more weapons research, the better. Adelot is trying to play the middle. They don't know where Oppenheimer is going to. Actually, Oppenheimer came here, and Einstein fears that this, if you build these weapons, it'll be too tempting to have preventive wars, which was sort of what von Neumann was arguing. Oppenheimer became the director. So the Institute became it's a credit to the diversity of the Institute that it could support these completely opposing views at the same time, that Oppenheimer and von Neumann were building, this is the Institute computer, which essentially was built to design the hydrogen bomb. That was the big push to get that machine running, and that really is the machine. More of the hydrogen bomb was built here at the Institute, really, than was built at Los Alamos. And so that was happening on the one hand, and on the other hand, so this is a logbook from the computer project, they're finished with one code over to the bomb codes. They weren't supposed to say that, but one of the engineers put that drawing in. That's Stan Frankel and Nick Metropolis. So there were people coming here from Los Alamos regularly on this, real serious weapons work going on at the Institute, while Einstein was completely pushing the other side, that his response after the war was over and the existence of nuclear weapons was proven, was, well, we need a world government to control this thing, and he started the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, which began here in Fuld Hall, and Adelot supported that strongly. So the Institute was the same way that still today supports completely different views of the same issue, could both be working on weapons and working against them, not being forced to take one side or the other. So Einstein pushed disarmament very, very strongly, took a lot of his time, and the effort that began here led to the sort of pugwash conferences and all sorts of things that had really saved us from maybe a worse fate than we're in. Einstein also took a very strong position on social issues. Here he's lecturing to Lincoln College in 1946. So he really kept strong on the social agenda. That's his office. I think the last blackboard he left. And the mythology circulated that his blackboards were preserved at Princeton University, and here Adelot is dismissing the mythology. Sorry. So I want to leave. The problem with history is that when things go wrong, a lot of papers are written. When there's a dispute or a big argument, then there's memos and there's records and reporters show up and so on. But so we forget how well things ran for most of the Institute's history. So I'm just going to give you two glimpses of really the times when when the historians and the mathematicians were cutting firewood together and getting along real well in the old times. So this is Panofsky, the art historian who was Einstein's friend. They decided to give Einstein a hi-fi. He loved music for his 75th birthday, and so the computer guys actually built this hi-fi. We have the circuit for it, so it could be recreated. Then the problem was they built copies of it for themselves, and then Oppenheimer tried to get them to pay for the parts. But the copy for Einstein was built and installed secretly in his house. Helen Dukas managed to get Einstein out of the house and slip the engineers in, and they had the whole thing built, and then one day he came home and they turned it on. And he loved that. He actually had special times when he just wanted to be alone and listen to concerts that were still broadcast on the radio. And then Panofsky had a dog that he was very fond of, and I don't know if Gerda is here. I gave this talk to the historians when I was here as a visitor, and I had the story of Panofsky's dog from the archive side, and then Gerda said, well, I really have the documents at home. So Panofsky had this dog who was unfortunately hit and killed by the Institute station wagon. And the whole faculty got together and purchased a puppy for Panofsky and then signed this scroll, which is there in translation. So they're giving Panofsky this puppy, and it's signed by all the great people at the Institute at that time. And not just the honorable, illustrious faculty, but people like Emma Epps, who was the servant in Panofsky's house, and the maintenance staff here built the doghouse. And so the whole group at that time really was a family, and Einstein was sort of the great jovial grandfather of that family. That's even the dog signed the scroll. And Einstein and Gödel, this is 2005 is the year of Einstein. 2006 will be the centenary of Gödel, and I hope we'll be celebrating that. So, we hear sort of the dark side of Gödel, but a lot of he and Einstein were great friends and had most of the time a very happy life here. Obviously, thanks to the founders who had the idea to make this possible, and I think I'm going to give the last word to them. This is Louis Bamberger reminding even the economists that really what the Bambergers wanted was to further the cause of social justice, and that's really what the Institute was founded on and should still be about. From my point of view, we know that we accept that there's 4 schools at the Institute. There's math, and there's physics, which there wasn't when Einstein came, and now social science, history, and biology, the 5th school. And then there's another, to me, the most important school at the Institute was, and there's, actually I'm jumping, Einstein and Gödel again, and what we forget is that the Institute really was built on a farm. I mean, this was originally Olin Farm that grew food, and then the founders in Veblen had this vision. They turned it into a farm for ideas, a place that really exists just to cultivate ideas. That's Einstein walking home, and we're all just so lucky to live, whether we live here for a year or for life, in this place. And the fact is that people, if you want to cultivate ideas, you want to cultivate young people. And it happens that, particularly in math and physics, that people cultivate their best ideas. They have their best ideas right about the same time they have their children. So the Institute has always had lots of children, and I was lucky to be one of these children. And the Institute was just such a great place to grow up. So the final school at the Institute is the Crossroads Nursery School. This is Crossroads in the 50s. So this generation after generation of children have got to grow up here in this world where they just see that people devote their lives to intellectual pursuits. And I think in the end, that's perhaps the greatest gift the Institute has given to the world, certainly to me, just to have that role model as a child. So thank you very much.